everybody, welcome back to the Truth Seekers channel. Today I'm gonna do the book of Enoch, the book 1 Enoch also called, and I was at chapter 19. And I looked until the time that 35 shepherds had pastured the sheep the same way, and each individually. They all completed their time like the first ones, and others received them into their hands to pasture them at their time, each shepherd at his own time. And after this I saw in the vision all the birds of the sky coming, the eagles, the vultures, and the kites, and the ravens. But the eagles led all the birds, and they began to devour those sheep, to peck out their eyes, and to devour their flesh. And the sheep cried out because the birds devoured their flesh. And I cried out and lamented in my sleep because of that shepherd who pastured the sheep. And I looked until those sheep were devoured by those dogs, and by the eagles, and by the kites, and they left them neither flesh nor skin, nor sinew, until only their bones remained. And their bones fell upon the ground, and the sheep became few. And I looked until the time that 23 shepherds had pastured, and they completed each in his time 58 times. And small lambs were born from those white sheep, and they began to open their eyes to see and to cry to the sheep. But the sheep did not cry to them, and did not listen to what they said to them, but were extremely deaf, and their eyes were extremely and excessively blinded. And I saw in the vision how the ravens flew upon those lambs, and took one of those lambs, and dashed the sheep in pieces, and devoured them. And I looked until horns came up on those lambs, but the ravens cast their horns down. And I looked until a big horn grew on one of those sheep, and their eyes were opened. And it looked at them, and their eyes were opened, and it cried to the sheep. And the ram saw it, and they all ran to it. And besides all this, those eagles and vultures and ravens and kites were still continually tearing the sheep in pieces, and flying upon them, and devouring them. And the sheep were silent, but the rams lamented and cried out. And those ravens battled and fought with it, and wished to make away with its horn, but they did not prevail against it. And I looked at them until the shepherds and the eagles and those vultures and kites came and cried to the ravens that they should dash the horn of that ram in pieces. And they fought and battled with it, and it fought with them and cried out, so that its help might come to it. And I looked until that man who wrote down the names of the shepherds and brought them up before the Lord of the sheep came, and he helped that ram and showed it everything. Its help was coming down. And I looked until that Lord of the sheep came to them in anger. All those who saw him fled, and they all fell into the shadow in front of him. All the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites gathered together, and brought with them all the wild sheep. And they all came together and helped one another in order to dash that horn off the ram in pieces. And I looked at that man who wrote the book at the command of the Lord, until he opened that book of the destruction that those last 12 shepherds had brought. And he showed in front of the Lord of the sheep that they had destroyed even more than those before them had. And I looked until the Lord of the sheep came to them, and took the staff of his anger and struck the earth. And the earth was split, and all the animals and the birds of the sky fell from those sheep and sank in the earth, and it closed over them. And I looked until a big sword was given to the sheep, and the sheep went out against all the wild animals to kill them, and all the animals and birds of the sky fled before them. And I looked until all throne was set up in a pleasant land, and the Lord of the sheep sat on it. And they took all the sealed books, and opened the books in front of the Lord of the sheep. And the Lord called those men, the 7 first white ones, and commanded them to bring in front of him the first star, which went before those stars, whose private parts were like horses, and they brought them all in front of him. And he said to that man who rode in front of him, who was one of the 7 white ones, he said to him, "Take those 70 shepherds to whom I handed over the sheep, and who on their own authority took and killed more than I commanded them. And behold, I saw them all bound, and they all stood in front of him. And the judgment was held, first on the stars, and they were judged and found guilty, and they went to the place of damnation, and were thrown into a deep place full of fire burning, and full of pillars of fire. And those 70 shepherds were judged and found guilty, and they also were thrown into that abyss of fire. And I saw at that time how a similar abyss was opened in the middle of the earth, which was full of fire. And they brought those blind sheep, and they were all judged and found guilty, and thrown into that abyss of fire, and they burnt. And that abyss was on the south of that house. And I saw those sheep burning, and their bones burning. And I stood up to look until he folded up that old house, and they removed all the pillars, and all the beams and ornaments of that house were folded up with it. And they removed it and put it in a place in the south of the land. And I looked until the Lord of the sheep brought a new house, larger and higher than the first one. And he set it up on the site of the first one that had been folded up. And all its pillars were new, and its ornaments were new and larger than those of the first one. The old one that had been removed, and the Lord of the sheep was in the middle of it. And I saw all the sheep that were left, and all the animals of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, falling down and worshipping those sheep, and entreating them, and obeying them in every command. And after this, those 3 who were dressed in white, and had taken hold of my hand, the ones who had brought me up at first, they, with the hand of that ram also holding me, took me up and put me down in the middle of those sheep before the judgment was held. And those sheep were all white, and their wool thick and pure. And all those which had been destroyed and scattered, and all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky gathered together in that house. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced very much, because they were all good and had returned to his house. And I looked until they had laid down that sword which had been given to the sheep, and they brought it back into his house. And it was sealed in front of the Lord. And all the sheep were enclosed in that house, but it did not hold them. And the eyes of all of them were opened, and they saw well, and there was not one among them that did not see. And I saw that that house was large, broad, and exceptionally full. And I saw how a white bull was born, and its horns were big, and all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky were afraid of it, and entreated it continually. And I looked until all their species were transformed, and they all became white bulls. And the first among them was a wild ox, and that wild ox was a large animal, and had big black horns on its head. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced over them, and over all the bulls. And I was asleep in the middle of them, and I woke up and saw everything. And this is the vision which I saw while I was asleep. And I woke up, blessed the Lord of righteousness, and ascribed glory to him. But after this I wept bitterly, and my tears did not stop until I could not endure it. When I looked, they ran down because of what I saw. For everything will come to pass and be fulfilled, and all the deeds of man in their order were shown to me. That night I remembered my first dream, and because of it I wept and was disturbed because I had seen that vision. Well, thank you for watching. That was the dream vision of Enoch. I will continue next time with the section 5, a book of Acts. exhortation and promised blessing for the righteous, and the malediction and woe for the sinners. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.
It's caught in the crossfire.